People go to abandoned places, grassy places, weeds and graveyards to search for their true nature. I think the plot line was that people used to sit up in graveyards thinking the awe of that time would somehow help them wake up, which I think is a very dubious proposition, but nonetheless, people go to abandoned places, grassy places, wasteland, to search for their true nature. At such a moment, honored one, where is your true nature? The term for true nature also means self-nature. So searching for your own self-nature. So I wanted to share with you something we did. We have occasional leaders groups, which are not very common, and mainly they're for people who are, anyway, who knows who they're for. But but one of the things we did this time was tell a story, and Tess and I worked with people on the story, and we decided to take on the Grail legend, and the Grail legend was like the great medieval story in France and England and Germany, and so in the High Middle Ages, and so there was a time when everything was changing, and you could tell things were starting to flower. The great cathedrals were being built, beauty started to be valued, which is not always the case in a big culture, So beauty and good writing and tale telling, and so there are many different versions of the story. There's this vast Arthurian cycle. It's a huge kind of kraken of stories, but the Grail legend is a part of that cycle, and so I thought I'd investigate that a little bit. And it's one of those stories. It's sort of a bigger story than some fairy tales are marvelous, like Vasilisa, which tells you about your own inner development, the development of your relationship to unseen things. The Grail legend is a bigger thing, though. It's about, I think it tells you about your own development, but also developments possible in a culture, a civilization that might be in transition. So I thought it'd be a good thing for us right now. And having said I'd do it, then I realized how incredibly confusing and vast the Grail cycle was. But it was sort of fun in a way, so I didn't really do very much else in my evenings approaching that time. So I'll just give you a little piece of the story. And the Grail cycle is usually, there are a lot of bits of it, but it doesn't have much. The King Arthur appears in it, but he's not one of the lead characters. And the English are very interested in Merlin and the death of Arthur and betrayal and those kind of themes. But the Grail cycle is not actually much interested in that stuff. So, and it starts out with somebody called Parsifal, or Percival in English, or Parzival in German, Percival, and he, meaning pierce the veil or pierce the heart, according to different medieval versions. And it starts out with this great thing. This is the French version. It was in the season when trees flower, shrubs leaf, meadows grow green, and birds in their own tongues sing sweetly in the mornings. So it's the southern hemisphere right now. It's not the northern hemisphere. But that's kind of fun. In the mornings, and everything is aflame with joy that the son of the widow lady of the waste forest arose effortlessly placed the saddle upon his hunter, his horse, and taking 3 javelins, left his mother's manor. He thought he would go to see some harrowers in his mother's service, who were harrowing her oats with 12 oxen and 6 harrows. Once you've scattered seed, a harrow is just dragging tines through the soil to bury the seed. People still do it if they're on tractors, dragging behind a tractor. I've done it with tractors, never done it with horses, or oxen. As soon as he entered the forest, his heart leapt within his breast because of the gentle weather and the songs he heard from the joyful birds. So it goes on like that. And because of the sweet, calm weather, he lifted the bridle from his horse's head and let it wander along, grazing through the fresh green grass. So that's the first interesting moment. He lets the horse guide him. So he's not on a mission. He's just wandering and feeling the time. So it's a meditation time. And so then I'll tell you bits of this. We're not going to go through the whole story today, but I'll tell you bits of it that may be salient. And then he's just wandering along like this, and he's got a couple of javelins, and he just, for no good reason, throws them at a tree and pulls them out again, just like a kid, really, and which he sort of is. And then he hears a noise, and hears this loud, clanging, clanking noise. And what it is, it's 5 or 6 knights in armor riding through the forest. And he's never heard that sort of noise before, because he lives with his mother in the West Forest. And the horse has itself led him onto different trails from the ones he'd normally go on. And so he decides, he's heard stories about devils and decides these must be devils. So he grabs his javelin and prepares he's going to kill the devils. And then they come through a clearing, and he sees them, and they've got a shining mail, like chain link mail, and they've got silk coats over that. Silk. There are technical medieval names for these, but I always screw them up, so I'm not going to use them. But the silks would be red and green and bright colours, and he sees them and he thinks, Mike, these are not devils, these must be gods. And so he immediately drops his javelins and he just lies flat on his face before them and looks up at them. And they're on the trail of someone. They're on a quest. They want some information from him. So they stop and ask him, has he seen a knight, some knights with some ladies ride by? The implication is probably the knights have captured some ladies, but it's not completely clear. But those knights want to rescue the ladies. And so that's, which is a common, one of the, scenario number 1 in the medieval romances, free the captured lady. And so that one of them says, look, he's terrified of us, and I'll go ahead and tell him we just want information. And so the leader comes up and he says he wants information. Have you seen these knights and with ladies ride by? And he says, what is this? Says Parsifal, grabs the guy's lance, and he says, it's a lance. He said, do you throw it? And he said, no, you thrust with it. And then he says, what is this? And grabs his leg armor, because he's on a horse. And he says, that's my greaves. And it protects me. And what is this? The breastplate armor. And so the guy says, but I'm supposed to be asking you information, and you keep asking me information. And then Parsifal says, what are you? And he says, are you God? He says, no, we're just knights. What is a knight? How do you get to be a knight? He says, well, King Arthur made me a knight 6 weeks ago at Caerleon, which is where his summer palace was. And he says, I want to go there. He said, well, if you just ask around, anybody will be able to tell you where King Arthur is. And he says, very good. And then he says, I don't know about those knights. I didn't see any knights coming through. If you go up the hill where the harrowers are, they will have seen. So he eventually surrenders and provides them information. Then he goes home to his mother and says, I'm going after King Arthur to become a knight. And his mother's been dreading this because his father died in the wars. His father was a great warrior and king. And his father died in the wars. And she's been hiding the notion of warfare and conflict and knighthood and all that from him, and has brought him up. She's kind of homeschooled him, and so to avoid all the evils of the culture. And so he's sophisticated in some ways. He's very ignorant of the culture, and he says, "Well, I'm going to leave right now." And she says, "Well, why don't you wait till the morning and then get a good night's sleep, and I'll make some special clothes for you." And she makes some special clothes that are hillbilly clothes, like they make him look ridiculous. The sackcloth and then some untanned leather, raw leather breeches, and he doesn't just look like a farmer; he looks like a clown in them. And that's her idea, that he won't do very well out there in the world, and they'll send him back. And so off he goes, and then she gives him some advice, and her advice is like notably bad, even for a mother. And she says, well, if a lady has beautiful red lips and wants to kiss you, it's okay to kiss her, and as long as she consents. And it's also, if she gives you a ring, it's all right to receive it and keep it as a measure of her affection. And also, if you meet a man with grey hair, an old man, it's all right to ask him questions, ask him to teach you the things about how to be a knight. He says, very well. He rides off, and he hears a scream from behind. He looks back, and his mother's sort of swooning and falling down as she sees him depart, but he does not turn back. And he just sees her collapse, and he just keeps going. And then a couple of other incidents are that he takes his mother's advice, and he comes upon a pavilion where there's a lady resting, and her husband is away hunting, and her serving maids are away gathering flowers, and she has beautiful red lips. So he just goes and kisses her and wakes her up, and she's enraged. She thinks he's gone mad. He must be some page boy gone mad, and she's enraged. And then he wants her ring, so he takes her ring off against her will. And then he sees all these venison pies and wine there, and he goes and eats a couple of the venison pies and drinks the wine, and then just takes off. And there's a whole plot interest here, because her husband happens to be the most jealous person in the whole kingdom. So we might get back to that. Anyway, then he rides off, and then he runs into, he gets guidance, and he comes to King Arthur's court, and King Arthur's court is in a fuss, because there's this knight in vermilion armor riding up and down, a big powerful knight in full war gear, riding up and down, challenging anyone to come out and fight him. And you still get that in Aikido dojos sometimes, probably mixed martial arts dojos and things. But anyway, they're riding back and forth, and no one has come out to challenge him. And he says, well, I'll take your kingdoms if you don't, And he's called the Vermilion Knight, or the Red Knight. And Parsifal asks him what's going on. The Vermilion Knight tells him. And so Parsifal then rides into the court, but being a bumpkin, he doesn't get off his horse, or he rides straight up to Arthur's seat on his horse, and he says, "I want to become a knight." And somebody says, "Boy, you'll have to get off the horse for that." And he says, "I won't get off this horse." And so he's a very stubborn spirit, and he can't get Arthur's attention, because Arthur's trying to deal with this crisis of the Red Knight, and he says, and so he turns his horse away, but the horse's head knocks Arthur's hat off. And Arthur says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've been rude. I haven't, monarch's supposed to be polite. What is it you wanted?" And he said, "I want the armor, that red armor of that knight that's riding around outside." And Arthur says, "Well, I don't think if you challenge him, he'll kill you." And but somebody in Arthur's court sort of who's notoriously has terrible judgment and is badly behaved, persuades Arthur, and who keeps all the accounts and things like that. He runs all the supplies and things like that. Kay is his name, Kay the Seneschal. Anyway, he says, no, let him go out, and Kay would be quite happy to see him killed. And Arthur says, well, are you sure? Yeah. And so he says, okay, I'll give you if you can get the knight armor off him, you can have it. And so the boy goes out to challenge the Red Knight, and what he does is he goes up to the Red Knight, thinks he's a page coming with news or something. He says, well, is somebody coming out to challenge me? He said, no one's going to come and challenge you. They're all too frightened. And the Red Knight's incredibly disappointed because he wants to have a real battle. And the boy, Parsifal, says, but he did give me your armor, so take it off. I want it now. Don't delay. Hurry up. Get that armor off you. And incredibly rude kid. And the knight, the Red Knight, is what? And then he starts to beat Parsifal with the butt of it. He's got this long lance, and he's beating with the butt of the lance, and Parsifal's bleeding and blood's shooting out, and he just looks up, and then he just stabs up through the visor of the war helmet he's got on and kills him. Goes through his eye and kills him. It's not the normal angle you would challenge a knight from. So then the knight falls off, and so then falls off and the horse is there, and so, but he can't get the knight out of his armor. He doesn't know what a buckle is or how to unbuckle it or anything like that. So a page comes out and sees the war horse standing there and thinks something's up, and goes out and helps him get the creature, the dead body out of the can. And so then he gets this armor, but he doesn't know how to put it on or anything. The page teaches him how to put it on. And they just abandon the dead knight there. But then people come out from the court who actually like the familiar knight and give him a burial and things. So then he rides off and he rescues there's a maiden under siege with a castle, and he rides off and he gets a mentor. His mentor, he comes to a place where there's an old man with grey hair sitting with a page beside him, and he has a hawk on his wrist. And the boy comes up and asks him for advice, and so the mentor just lets the hawk go, and it goes back to the castle, and then people come out to assist, and the knight teaches him how to ride a horse. He doesn't know how to stop a horse, actually. He can get on it. He doesn't know how to stop a horse, things like that. So he's comically deadly and unaware. But the knight thinks he's got something promising, and he's a bit sad because he was a friend of the Red Knight, the Vermilion Knight, and he sees the armor and he knows what's happened. And so, but he says, well, it's the way of the world, and so he invites the boy to stay the night, and he does. Then there's some sort of thought that he'll marry the castle keeper's daughter and stay, but he can tell he can't settle down right now, so he takes off. Then he rescues there's another castle under siege with a great siege going on, and he lifts the siege. He charges into the people have been starving them out for 6 months, and he charges into the enemy troops, who are kind of pretty sleepy by this time. They're just waiting for the castle to fall, and he saves the castle, marries the queen of the castle, who had inherited it from her father. But then he has to go off he just has to go off finding out things. He's a warrior now. Arthur did make him a knight, all that kind of thing. If he got the armor, he became a knight. And so he just goes off adventuring, and he rides off into a land that he doesn't recognize, and then he comes upon a swift river, and he tries to cross it, and he can't cross it. And he's looking for a bridge or a ford, but it's deep and swift and wide. And then he sees there's a couple of people fishing in a boat in the river, and he waits for them to drift downstream to him, but he realizes they must be anchored because they're not drifting. So he rides up towards them and asks, how do I find a bridge or a ford here? Excuse me, my lords. And they say, well, not for 20 leagues, not for 60 miles in either direction will you find a bridge or a ford. So we're suddenly in the fairy tale world, the magic world. And he says, oh, is there anywhere to find lodging? And they say, not for 60 leagues, not for 60 miles, not for 20 leagues. But then he says, the man says, I'll give you lodging for the night, the fisherman says, and go up between the cliffs. He goes up between the cliffs, and he comes to the top of the cliffs and looks around, but he can't see the building. He starts cursing the fisherman for lying to him and wasting his energy and things like that. And he's incredibly hot-tempered and wishes ill upon the fisherman. Then his horse takes another step and he sees a castle, the turrets of a castle, and there's a beautiful big castle there. And so he rides in, the drawbridge is down for him, and he just rides in and people welcome him. And the fisherman is in there lying down, and it turns out he's wounded, and he cannot walk, and he has to be carried, and he can only sit in a reclining posture. And then the young man, he's very intimidated by the richness and the multitude of warriors and beautiful ladies in the court, but the fisherman beckons him up. Come on up, sit next to me. And so he sits next to the fisherman, and then he sees the marvelous food and wine comes, but he sees something even stranger. He sees a page walk by with a great lance, and he's got it halfway up there, and the blood is coming out of the tip of the lance and bleeding down onto his hand. And the page comes out of one room on the side of the palace and goes into the other room. Another room disappears, and then another page comes through with this huge golden candelabras in each hand. And the third thing that happens is a woman comes out with a golden dish, and as soon as the golden dish appears, all the lights in the room become brighter and brighter and brighter. There's something sacred going on. She too appears silently, but all these strange sights pass between him and the fire, so they're incredibly visible to him. And she passes into another room, and this happens. And then the fisher king, who he's sitting next to, tells him, I'm sorry I can't get up. I have a wound and I just can't stand up to welcome guests. But, I'm happy to sit beside you and answer any questions you have or anything like that. And he thinks, what are those strange things? What's going on there? And he says, well, I don't know. My mother told me, both the knight and my mother told me not to ask too many questions because I'm a country bumpkin. And so not to ask too many questions. And so he doesn't. And he says, I'll ask the servants in the morning. But the night goes on, and the Grail King, was very courteous. And then he says, I must retire, and he has to be carried. They pick up the coverlet the Grail King is on and carry him off into his chamber, and then people show Parsifal where he can sleep the night, and people help him get his shoes off and things like that. And then he goes to sleep, and then he wakes up in the morning and there's no one around, and he goes outside and his clothes are there and he puts them on, and his armor's there and he puts it on, but he tries to go in the great hall, but it's locked, and the whole castle is dark, and not only that, it's cold. The fires have gone out, it's not warm. And so then he walks out and his horse is by the door, and so he thinks, oh, they just must have gone out for a ride or something. So he gets on his horse and he rides across the drawbridge, and as he's towards the end of the drawbridge, it starts to lift up. And he calls back and saying, who's there? Who's there? But there's never an answer, and he calls out and there's no one there. And the drawbridge closed and he rides off, and he rides up the hill, and he turns around, he can't see a castle. So that's... I suppose that's where we need to stop for today. and then he goes to people who explain things. So one of his relatives, he goes to this cousin of his who is nursing her dead husband or a dead lover has been killed by a passing knight, and turns out to be a cousin of his, knows all about the Grail. And she says, I'll tell you this, but she says, well, you were at the Grail. Nobody can ever find the Grail castle. You were there. That's wonderful. And did you meet the Grail King and see he's disabled? And he has his disability is about fertility, and which is why there's a wasteland around. He's had a lance thrust through his scrotum, and he needs to be healed, but he can't be healed. No one can heal him, and that's why he can't walk. And and she says, so did you see the lance that was carried by, and the vessel, the golden vessel that's the Grail? And he said, yes, I did. So she said, did you ask him who was being fed by the Grail, or did you ask him what was wrong with him, the king? He said, oh no, I didn't think it'd be polite to ask questions. And she said, what is your name? And he doesn't really know his name, but it comes to him, Parsifal. And she says, you know, you have been Parsifal the lucky because you found the Grail castle, but now you're Parsifal the miserable, Parsifal the unfortunate, because if you had asked a question of him, the king would have been healed and the whole land would have flourished. And so he feels very unhappy about this, and then he just takes off, and he takes off, and eventually he finds his way to. I better finish this part. The woman who was mourning her husband, and he says, "Well, would you like me to escort you somewhere, or would you like me to take vengeance on the knight who killed your husband?" And she thinks, I don't think that would help very much right now. And she said, I'm going to stay with him. He's not even buried. And she's going to arrange a tomb for him and things like that. So he rides off, and on the track off, and then he runs across this woman who's just dressed in rags, and her body is exposed. She's naked or semi-naked, and she's got rags she's trying to hold off herself. And she's got this horse that's amazingly thin and scrawny and broken down. And he says, oh, what's up? Can I help? What's going on with you? And it turns out she's the woman he kissed when he was a young idiot. And her husband then refused to give her new clothes or feed her horse ever since, in the year, you say the year since. And she says, but you must go now, because I keep trying to get my husband to kill me, but I'm so unhappy. Because I'm so unhappy, but he won't. He must like tormenting me. And so then the husband appears and starts yelling, I'm going to kill you now for, talking to my wife, And he says, well, hang on. What's the problem? And this enraged, haughty knight explains that all the things she did, that she confessed that she kissed this person who came. It must have been her lover, and he ate his pies and drank his wine, and it's a kind of interesting passage in the book, because there's a whole thing about he doesn't believe the woman when she says he kissed me, but it wasn't my fault, and it's your lover. And so there's some sort of transition going on in the culture where you have to believe the woman, but the haughty knight doesn't. And he says, well, if she kissed him, she slept with him, like that, And Parsifal's, but hang on, I know what happened, because I was the young idiot who did that. And I kissed her, and I did take her ring, and I ate your pies and your wine. But eating your pies and your wine sounds pretty sensible to me. and he says, but it wasn't. It was wrong of me to kiss your lady and take her ring, but nothing else happened. And the knight says, what? You confess? Prepare to die. And so he charges at him, but then Parsifal, being a natural athlete, defeats him and gets he's about to kill him, and unlaces his helmet, and he's got a sword at his throat, and he says, well, the guy asks for mercy, and he says, well, okay, I'll send you this place to get mercy, back to my mentor. And his mentor had told him, if someone asks for mercy and you don't have a mortal grievance against them, you should give them mercy, and you can get them to do anything that you need to do, So if you owe somebody some sort of favor, they can do the favor for you. And so, but nobody likes the haughty knight. Everybody wants to kill him. And so he says, I know, I'll send you to Arthur's court, and there you can do whatever is asked of you. And the guy agrees and trots off to Arthur's court. And no, but before that, you will have to take the lady to a castle, your nearest castle. The guy owns several, and have her bathed and clad and fed until she's restored to health. And you will always have to believe her when she asks you something. And then you'll ride with her to Arthur's court, say what you're doing, and apologize to her in front of them, and bring the ladies out. And then you will have to do whatever it is Arthur wants of you. And the guy agrees to all this. So there's this little theatre going on there. And then after that, he becomes, it's a Celtic tradition of the hero or somebody going mad and wandering in the wilderness. So he does that for many years, and eventually does get back to the Grail Castle and asks the question. He has to ask the question for the healing to happen. So I'll stop there. And there's something marvelous about if you don't ask the question, if you're too passive, if you don't investigate what's really happening around you. And also there's an empathy thing, because the main question is, what ails thee? What ails thee? Uncle or father, what ails thee? And when, in the end, when he comes back and asks that, then the wasteland starts, the grass starts to green and grow immediately, and birds start to sing, and he eventually becomes the next Grail Lord, wearing insignia with turtle doves. So I think there's one other great figure I keep thinking I can stop here, but there's one other great figure I want to introduce. When he after defeating the haughty knight and so on, he goes back to Arthur's castle, and he feels like, well, I screwed up about asking the question, but life's not that bad. Here I am at Arthur's castle, a knight of Arthur the Round Table, and things like that. And then somebody rides in whose face is concealed. A maiden rides in who's very elegant of speech, and she speaks French and German and English and Arabic, and it's all the civilized languages. And she, possible exception of English, is not a civilized language at that time, and she goes to Arthur and says, and she unwinds her wrapping around her face, and she's amazingly, marvelously hideous. She has tusks, boar's tusks coming out of her mouth, and her face is like brown leather with hair coming out of it, and she has topaz eyes like a goat. And she says, Parsifal should not be in your court. He failed the test of the Grail. You need to send him out of here. Your whole court, nothing will prosper in your court while he's here. And then she sends the knights off on some errand to free castles, lift sieges, and marry ladies. And so, which is always the solution to everything in the Grail story. But anyway, so Parsifal then wanders around in the wilderness for many years before he gets purified. He meets a hermit and starts to do practices, and he fasts and eats roots with the hermit and prays and things like that. And then the hideous lady, who is a Grail messenger and has turtle doves all over her cape, comes back and invites him back to the Grail, that she can lead him to the Grail castle that no one can find. And she does, and then he becomes the next Grail king. He says, "What ails thee, father?" And the whole land comes back to life. So, just let the story bang around inside your psyche and your heart and things like that. Tess, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Oh, probably lots of things. Let's see if I can. I'll be like you with the story, see if I can whittle them down to something reasonable. Um, I was noticing as I was listening to you tell it this time how much there's this interesting parallel between how something in him knows where to go and what to do, but at the same time, he has absolutely no idea where he's going or what he's doing, and how those things just keep kind of weaving themselves. And I was thinking about the vermilion armor that becomes the beacon at a certain time. And I was remembering when I was about I think I was about 19, and I had, when I was about 18, caught a glimpse of something that I just knew, I'm going there, I'm doing that. And but I didn't have any money and didn't really have any skills, and had a high school degree and whatever. And I somehow got the chance to present to a venture capitalist to ask for like 10 grand. And the guy I was dating at the time bought me a red suit to wear. And I was thinking, oh, my red armor that I'm somehow going to present to these guys to ask for money, really based on like a lot of convincing nothing. I will do something really impressive and valuable with this money, having absolutely no idea what I was talking about. And I had made a whole PowerPoint presentation, and I had, done all these things in my red vermilion suit. And somehow, sort of like the kindness of Arthur or something, this guy decided, like, I don't know, why not? Sure, kid, here's like 10 grand, good luck to you. And it started this whole quest. And then from that point on, for many years, I sort of just kept bashing into everything, like learning, but having just these incredible whims of where I thought I was going and grand reasons for doing so, but really having no idea where I was going and just bashing into things and learning things, and sort of creating, I don't know, enough karma that eventually I had to face. But that there comes this point, like in the story, after he sees the Grail and doesn't really know what to do with it yet, that everything just starts to turn on him, and it's no longer about bashing into things. He can still do that, and he can still find things, but he doesn't really know what he's looking for anymore, and he's less certain. And I think that part gets very interesting, especially with regard to what we're doing, that you just reach a point where you've got some skills, and you may have seen some stuff, and you may even have a reasonable practice and some idea of who you are, but all that doesn't hold up anymore after a certain point. And that's when, grief enters and difficulty enters and uncertainty enters, but actually the story really starts to enrich at that point. And so, I don't know, there's so many more things I could say, but I want to hear from other people, so I'll leave it there for now.
How about Angela?
Yeah. Blackbirds are kind of emblematic of a whole race for me. They seem to have been present at moments of intensity throughout my life. And, as you were saying, this season here in the Southern Hemisphere is full of them again, from before daylight till after dark. And I've been thinking how they were there as my sister died, they were there as another friend died, and just feeling very grateful for that accompaniment and thinking I would love them to be there at my last moment too. They're so utterly in the present. I've just been away for a few days, staying beside the sea with a friend whose daughter is very sick, and somehow we kept going out into the sadness of that and coming back to laughter and waking with the sound of the sea and going to sleep with the sound of the sea and the sound of the blackbirds. And they brought us back every time. So that's all really to the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Alison, did you want to say anything?
Well, I keep coming back to the image of Parzival sitting in the Fisher King's castle and at the feast, and seeing the candelabra and the sword and the Grail bowl filled with light, seeing things and knowing things and not speaking, not yet being able to include them in some way. And you could, on one sense, you might think of that as a failure at that point, and actually the conditions had not yet ripened for him to speak. There were more things that he had to live through. And perhaps the Fisher King had to suffer a little more. We don't know. I was in Boston a couple of weeks ago visiting my daughter, and we were at lunch downtown at this very fancy restaurant. And there'd been some distance and pain between us for a while. And I think I knew, I kind of knew, but I didn't want to know what it was between us. And I wasn't able to ask her previously the question, what ails thee, daughter? And that lunch, something about the conditions had changed, and that question was able to be included. And it was very hard to hear what ails the king, what ails the daughter, to be able to include the whole of one's situation. And but to feel that it had to ripen on its own, that both she and I and the waiter, who was so sort of startled by these two women crying at the table, he was afraid to bring the butter for the bread, come take our order. And how all of the flourishing that then began to happen, all the green grass that began to grow. But somehow to be able to have some patience and grace and not be forcing things, to be able to be in my place in the story at any time, I think allowed for that question finally to be asked.
Thank you. It's got a very nice example of the Grail speech. Jesse Carden,
I think just kind of reflecting briefly this morning on all the abandoned grassy places I've been searching, and maidens that I've kissed, and rings and meat pies that I've stolen, and fights that I've got into, and all to get me to the place where I could see the bleeding lance and see the Grail and ask the question, what ails thee, Father? And the healing that comes out of that, just the whole kingdom starts to flourish again, and there's joy and children playing and cats and, pickleball in a little bit. And It was wonderful to take the journey again and again, just to look back from this point and see that the whole journey was blessed. All the idiotic things that I did and the clownish clothes that I wore and the wrong moves that I made, they're all blessed. That was my true nature at that time. Much.
Thank you, Jesse. George Foy, do you want to? I've had one of your books for quite a while. Well, I've had a couple of your books before, but I was reading it and some guest hid it somewhere in the house. And this is your navigation book, and it just appeared again in the bookshelves. It was great. So I've been reading about your navigation adventures and your old boat, and I think it's kind of wonderful. So tell us things. It doesn't have to be about that, but that's your Grail adventures on the waters.
Only fitting that the book should be lost. A few things struck me. Going back to the birds, my friend Dale hates crows because crows were kind of cawing around the house where her father died. When my first son died, I buried him in the garden, and the first bird that I saw was a goldfinch. It was a beautiful, small little bird flitting around. I immediately put my son into him and just sort of figured that was Olivier. And I find that ability to translate oneself into another being, however different in consciousness, just kind of magical. An example of that, there's a cemetery, and I was going back to the wasteland idea of around the Fisher King. There's a cemetery near here where I'm going to run a bit later, and I always run by one of those little headstones that they put up for children, and this headstone was carved with the name Little Addie Nickerson, who lived a total of 11 months and 19 days. And the fact that they carved Little Addie just really opened me up to this child, I'd obviously never met and who died a century before my son had. But I just think that's a quest in and of itself, to be able to put oneself into these beings that we don't know. It's crucial to our own quest, and it never ends, and it never should. And that's all I have to say, but thank you.
Thank you, George. People go to the wasteland. People go to abandoned places to search for their true nature. At such a moment, where is your true nature?